Hello and welcome to the Wellness Connection. I'm your host, Fiona Kane. Lately, I've been reading a book by Buck Sexton, and it's about brainwashing, and it's manufacturing delusion, how the left uses brainwashing, indoctrination, and propaganda against you. And I just thought it was interesting the way he described it as what I've been seeing and what I've been railing against, but I didn't always have the language for it, what I've been seeing in our culture, in our world over the last 5 to 10 years, but particularly sort of the last 5 years or so. And so I thought it would be interesting to talk about that, interesting to talk about language and why it matters so much, but also some things in the news that I think are relevant and important. So, interestingly, since the last time I was talking about these issues, there's a few things that there's been some updates on. So, one is I wrote about and did a podcast about Jacinta Allan, the Victorian Premier in Australia. So this is the Australian Victorian Premier, so the leader of that state. And I remember I was looking back, it's like, when did I last write it? Because I thought it was a while ago, and it was in actually July 2024. I first started talking about how terrible this politician was, and who would have thought there could be someone worse than Dan Andrews, who was before her. But she's equally as bad as Dan Andrews. So a couple of years ago, I was writing about her, and I was talking about the fact that what she was doing is she put out an advertising campaign essentially to make women and young girls not use their intuition. And I'll go into that in a little bit detail in a moment. But what I also noticed, the thing that was in the news currently, is that essentially there was an issue in Victorian prisons where an inmate was sexually assaulted by a man pretending to be a woman, right? This is an issue in all of the countries that are still hanging on to this ideology, which would be places like the UK, although they've let go a little bit of some of this stuff, and Canada, terrible at this, and Australia is one of those places as well, where we continue to hang on to this ideology that says trans women are women, full stop. Therefore, they can be in all women's spaces, including prisons. And there was a case here where it was like when people were fighting back against Jacinta Allan and saying that women shouldn't have men in their prisons with them, that she had already had a situation where there'd been a sexual assault, and she's paid off. This woman was paid out for what she'd been through. But at the time that all this was going on, Jacinta Allan was saying, oh, there's no risk, there's blah, 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 even though she already knew it had already happened at the time. We only just found out it had happened at the time. But even though it had already happened, she was claiming that there's no risk and that women are perfectly safe with men in their prisons. And the argument they use is that these men are unsafe in men's prisons, which is kind of the argument for women, like why we don't want them. If men are unsafe in men's prisons, why do we want men in women's prisons, right? But in this particular case, it was just terrible because it turns out besides all the reasons, obviously it was terrible, but the people associated with the prison actually also did say this was a terrible idea, it was going to end badly, blah, blah, blah. So there was a whole lot of warnings against this happening. This man was put into a prison cell with a woman who had a small baby with her, who had been a victim of sexual assault. And yeah, guess what happened? Just horrific. So that's Jacinta Allan's government covering this up and pretending it's not an issue, and still thinking it's okay to put men in women's prisons, in women's cells, and too bad for suicidal empathy, right? You care about the victim class here, the oppressed class, is the person who identifies as trans, not the women. So because it's the person who identifies as trans is the victim class here, is the oppressed class, Too bad about everybody else. Their rights do not matter. We've always got to remember that this ideology that champions the victimhood and the victim class, and the victim class who is the biggest victim class is the one who wins out, and everybody else is too bad. So in a situation where it's up against someone who's trans, they're the biggest victim. So everybody else doesn't matter. So this has been going on with this in Victoria. Well, the thing that I first sort of railed against her in regards to this is that in Victoria, in what did I say, was July 2 years ago, there was an advertising campaign run, and the advertising campaign was a campaign to reduce transphobia, which is a made up word. People aren't afraid. Well, actually, that's a whole other. So, the reason people reject the trans thing is not because they're against individuals or because they hate individuals or because they're terrified of a man in a dress or whatever. It's because they understand reality and they want safety for certain groups or fairness and that sort of thing. But anyway, she put out this ad, and the advertising campaign was that the unsaid says a lot, and at the very least, this advertising campaign was offensive to women, but I would say it was actually dangerous to women. And the reason why is because it was telling women to ignore their intuition. So women have been harnessing and using their intuition since forever, and we've had to, because women are in general the weaker and more vulnerable sex, and so we have had to learn how to listen to our intuition so we could survive. And also we're usually protectors of children, infants, old people, whatever. So the vulnerable. So we've had to learn how to listen to our intuition. This particular advertising campaign, in one of the ads, like a man who identifies as a woman gets into a lift, and the woman who was already in the lift decides to get out. Now, this man was like 6'5", big man. I think he might have been, I don't know if he was Aboriginal or Islander or what he is, but just a really, really big man, right? And the way that this campaign, the way that the ad plays it out is essentially the woman's a bigot for getting out of the lift. Now, most women will tell you there's been situations where they've been, in a lift or in some situation where they've been alone with a man where they've felt unsafe and they've chosen to remove themselves from that. Unfortunately for women, whoever's feelings get hurt by this, it's too bad, because women need to protect themselves. And sometimes that means listening to our intuition. Now, whether or not that is a man in the lift or a woman in the lift or a man who thinks is a woman, whether or not that person's got this colour skin, that colour skin, the other colour skin, this race, this religion, it's irrelevant. If you feel unsafe, you have a right to remove yourself from that situation. Now, are you sometimes overreacting, and that man might be the nicest person in the world? Possibly, but that's actually something that men just have to deal with. Men can't have their feelings hurt by that. It's just too bad, because the risk is too high for women. So essentially, we have to use our radar. We have to get out of situations where we feel unsafe. But what we're doing now is we're saying, what the Victorian government is saying is, and not just them, but just all of these idiots who say the same things, is stop listening to your intuition. The feelings of the other person are more important than your safety. So what we're being taught is, forget your safety. It's all about the feelings of the other. And the feelings of the other, it's whatever victim group, because whatever victim group it is, they're more important than you. So essentially, we're being taught to ignore our intuition. And there was another ad in the same campaign, and this other ad was, a man joining a women's football team. And everyone's smiling because they're so inclusive and, whatever. And again, there's a lot of danger associated with this. It's a whole episode in itself. I think I've talked about it before, actually, with the dangers of men and women's sports. But, the dangers of especially a contact game like that, where, you could get tackled or harmed by a man, not intentionally, but it's a rough sport. It's rough already without adding that element to it. Besides the fact that things like privacy and fairness, and a woman misses out on being in the team because a man's on the team, and safety in locker rooms and all that kind of stuff. So the Victorian government have absolute form on this sort of stuff, and it's the same story. And so it brings me back to this book that I've started reading by Buck Sexton, and essentially Buck is talking about how this brainwashing occurs, and he's comparing it to the brainwashing that happened in the USSR under Stalin, and in China under the Chinese Communist Party. And essentially the stuff he's saying, it's a kind of, it's the playbook is just perfect. So I was having a look at this, and he was talking about that, it's this whole totalitarian thing where they want to take over, and they want to control the language, and they want to control what everyone thinks and says, etc. And something came up actually in the news this week that kind of confirms it, really, and it shows how ridiculous this stuff is. In Canada, this is a classic example of this like brainwash stuff, right? So in Canada, who've gone absolutely mental with their progressivism, socialism, social justice stuff, it's just way over the top. This will give you an example of why. So Barry Neufeld, a former school trustee who opposed gender ideology in schools, has been ordered to pay $750,000 to the Chilliwack Teachers Association. So the BC, British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal literally stated the following: if a person elects not to believe that gender identity is separate from sex assigned at birth, I would argue, well, it's not assigned, it's observed. But anyway, I'm quoting. If a person elects not to believe that gender identity is separate from sex assigned at birth, they do not believe in trans people. This is a form of existential denial. A person does not need to believe in Christianity to accept that another person is Christian. However, to accept that a person is transgender, one must accept that their gender identity is different than their sex assigned at birth. So they've actually said that British Columbians must believe in gender identities. It's illegal not to. So they're actually telling you what you're legally allowed to believe, that you must believe in gender identities. And that is, well, what do you think all of this hate speech stuff going on in Australia is about? In Australia, they brought in all these hate speech laws, and essentially it was, it's a good thing, and it's because we care about what happened to Bondi, and we care about the Jewish community. And look, if it was, I'd be all for it. Like I'm all for that, right? I'm all for let's have a whole lot less of what happened at Bondi, and a whole lot more care about our Jewish friends and that sort of thing. However, the Albanese government didn't bring that in because he cares about the Jewish community. He brought that in so he could use it in other ways, in my opinion. And one of those ways will be this sort of stuff, right? It will be, I'm offended by what you said, and you're not allowed to believe or say certain things. And, this language thing, it shows the language thing in here, right? So first of all, a man is allowed to believe whatever he wants to. And, I believe that trans people exist. I believe that they believe that they're trans, and but I also believe it's a mental health issue. It's a mental illness, and so indulging in that and saying, "Oh, yes, you really are a woman," when someone is not, I don't think is helpful. However, this is about language policing, and notice in that article, in that judgment twice, they referred to assigned at birth. This is one of the language changes that they've made. So when you look at the language changes they made in places like China and places like USSR, a lot of it had to do with changing the language. And you change the language, and changing the language is part of brainwashing, right? So we say assigned at birth, not observed at birth. It's always been known that sex is observed at birth, right? Doctor looks and says, oh, that's a boy, oh, that's a girl, right? That's pretty obvious and, and makes sense. Suddenly now we're saying assigned, like, oh, well, we don't know what they're going to be, so we'll just say what we think they are, and then later on they can decide there's something else, right? So that is indulging in the mental health issue and indulging in their sort of language, the language policing. So, the other thing is that, when you read stories about someone who considers themselves trans, the leftist media, which is most of the media, go out of their way to only identify them as whatever sex that they identify as. They won't identify them as who they actually are. And you see that a lot in one of the reasons I think that people don't realize how many violent acts are being committed by people who consider themselves trans is that the media just calls them whatever they want to be called. So most recently, it's a young man who thought, who identified as a woman, who did a school shooting. It just had horrible, horrible school shooting where he killed all these young children and harmed all these young children. And he also killed his own mother and brother. And but the media's all saying her, this girl, and it's not a girl. It was a guy. But to protect, we have to protect his identity and his feelings. No, we don't. He just killed a whole bunch of people. We don't. And the fact that his mum supported him and was really supportive and actually started being involved politically in the community in regards to supporting trans teens, and ultimately he killed his mother and his brother, tells you how much of a mental health issue it is, and tells you how much of an issue it is if you just blindly support this ideology. Blindly support. I'm not saying not to have sympathy and empathy for people who are in this situation. It's a dreadful situation to be in, and it must be terrible to feel like you were born in the wrong body. So I absolutely have all the sympathy and all the empathy in the world for that. But it's no different to if someone feels like they're in the wrong body and they feel like they're too fat and they must starve themselves. If I say, yeah, here, go on a diet, here, take a Ozempic, when a person, is starving themselves to death, I haven't helped them, right? So we can't affirm people in their delusions. It doesn't help them. And as societies, we've been doing that, and it doesn't help them. It just actually goes, because the problem is you say, oh, yes, you are a woman, and yes, the doctor made a mistake, and you really are a different sex, and you really can change sex, blah, blah, blah. And in the reality of the world, they can't. The reality is no matter how many surgeries they have, no matter what they do, they can never be the opposite sex. They're never going to be able to do the same things or be the same as the opposite sex. And at some point they realize that, right? And then what they do is they frame not being accepted, in like women's prisons and things like that. They frame that as a genocide. You're being genocided because people don't accept you. Or this Canadian people who made this ruling against this guy who doesn't sort of believe in the trans identity thing. That's a genocide. Not believing that is a genocide. So you affirm these people in a delusion that means that they cannot accept the body they're in, and they have to spend their whole life fighting against the body they're in. You affirm that, you support that, makes their life worse. They get more mentally ill. And you wonder why that happens. Like it's just crazy town. Anyway, and you think that you're helping the person, you're not helping the person. We have to help people live in the world that they are in, and the body that they're in, and the reality that they're in. Reality matters. And you can fight up against reality as hard as you want to, but ultimately reality will smack you in the face at some point. And so it's better to actually deal in reality with people and help people be in the real world. So the other thing that he talks about in here, so he talks about this mass delusion and the conditioning, and a lot of the conditioning has been around language. So they've said that we're not allowed to call, so parents, instead of being called mother and father in Australia, they tried to change the language in hospital situations. You'd go in and as a as a mother, and you'd be called the birthing person, or the birthing parent, I think it was, can't remember now. And the husband was like the non-birthing person, that sort of stuff. And people did fight back against that, and I think they've got mother and father back in there again. But taking away language, you can't use the term breastfeeding; it's offensive. You have to use chest feeding. It's offensive to the guy who wants to take hormones so he can pretend he's breastfeeding, right? Uh, Crazy town, but that's where we are. We've got to use real language, and we can't be afraid to use real language, and we can't let these people control the narrative and control the language. So, trans women are men. They're not women. Women are women. Women are adult human females. That's what a woman is. A woman is not a feeling. It's not a thought. It's not how I feel today. A woman is an adult human female. We need to actually use real language. And, and I like Billboard Chris has a great way of describing this. He says that there are two sexes, zero genders, and infinite personalities. And I agree with that. Gender used to be a synonym for sex, right? So it's just another way of saying sex, or we might have used it in terms of where we were talking about gender, what different genders would do. So like if one was more likely to play sport or be strong or be whatever, be parents, be like, I'm using all the wrong language. My brain's just like clocked out. We use gender in terms of talking about the way society, gender roles. Okay, that's how we use the term gender a lot. I don't use the word gender anymore because it's been hijacked, and it's all about their feeling, and it's this belief that everyone has a gendered soul, and so you are in the body that you're in, but you've got this gendered soul that it might be completely opposite to that. And how about you've just got a personality? You've just got the personality of who you are, and that might be more one way, more the other, as far as feminine, masculine, whatever, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean you're born in the wrong body. Just express who you are, be who you are, fine, but you don't need to change your sex to do that. And it's actually, I think it's really regressive to do that, not progressive to do that. So a lot of this changing of language, a lot of it's deliberately meant to create confusion. Trans women are women, blah, blah, blah. Half the time people don't know if you're talking about men or women or what you're talking about. They also talk about dead naming. You're not allowed to name a person, like if I called Bruce Jenner, that's dead naming him, and that's really offensive. And so it's like this weird thing where, because what does he call himself now? I can't remember his name. What do you call it? Caitlyn Jenner, I think he calls himself. And look, fine. He calls himself Caitlyn. Good on him. Whatever. He's still a man. And Bruce did exist. And the problem with saying that, as part of the delusion, isn't it? It's just saying we're banning people, dead naming. You can't name who you were before. It's kind of, it reminds me a lot of things like Scientology. And in Scientology, you're not allowed to talk about the things that happened before or who you were before, whatever. And when people have different opinions, like if someone actually says that the truth, you can say that they're problematic person, and you don't want to be around or listen to problematic people. So it's just the same thing here. There's so much around language that they try and change. So the other thing that we talk about here is that sorry, I'm just trying to get my bearings of where I am with my notes here, because I wanted to make sure I was making sense. What they also do is they suppress dissent, and they try and destroy the people who say the things. And so anyone who says the stuff I've said here today is called a transphobe or a bigot or this or that or a TERF, trans exclusionary, radical feminists, whatever, all sorts of names. And I've lost friends over this. I have, because I just want to tell the truth. And it's because I actually care about these people. It's not because I don't care. That's a thing. It's like it's framed as if you don't accept someone's identity and just go into the delusion with them that you are an evil and bad person and you hate them and you want them genocided. And it's the complete opposite. I want these people to have full lives. I want them to actually be happy and comfortable living in their own body and be able to have children if that's what they choose to do when they get older, and be able to have sexual pleasure, which is what they miss out on if you interfere with their bodies too much, and be able to just be full humans that live a full human life that they were meant to live in the body that they have. And that's what I want for these people. And what we've done is we've completely framed it the other way around, where it's, if you don't accept the delusion, if you just don't go along with it, if you don't join them hook, line, and sinker and just go the whole way, then you're evil and bad and you hate them and you're hateful. And that's how they've hooked in all the women into this, because women are particularly caring and we care about the vulnerable. And, we've been convinced that if you care about the vulnerable, you'll help all of these trans kids. There's no such thing as trans kids. There's confused kids, but we've created a whole new category of trans kids, and we've turned it into, a human rights issue, as in if we don't accept and fully go into and fully embrace the whole trans agenda and the whole trans ideology, that we're anti-human and anti-human rights and hateful, it's and it's opposite to that. It's because we care. So the good news is some other news to share with you. And I just was seeing if there's anything else in regards to that book that I wanted to share. I think there will be more over time, but just remember that when you hear a lot of the language, when they want you to call a man a woman, and when they want you to ignore the elephant in the room, and when they want you to stop using terms like, mother and breastfeeding, or if they want to start saying things like, assigned at birth rather than observed at birth, things like, just notice the language and reclaim it back. Don't let them change the language, and preferred pronouns and all that sort of carry on. Don't let them change the language. This is all subtle ways to they're programming you. They really are programming you. They're programming us. That is the whole idea. And they do that to control you, and they want to make a whole bunch of changes, and destabilizing a society is a good way of doing that. Now, some good news is that in the US, they're doing some sensible things around this, and because a whole bunch of hospitals are going to lose their funding if they keep doing these gender surgeries on children, a whole bunch of hospitals have stopped doing it. There's a whole list of them all over the US. It's fantastic news. They're stopping doing their gender transition surgeries. In the UK, they were about to do a trial on doing puberty blockers for children, and again they've put a hold on that because there's questions about how safe that is, because we are actually starting to really look at the data. I will have a future episode coming out where I'm going to be talking more about the endocrinology, just more about physically what happens when you use puberty blockers on children, and it's not good news. It's not healthy at all. So that's really good that's happening in the US, some sensible things happening in the world. Also, the other good thing that's happening is in Australia, we actually had a ruling, a sensible ruling. So we've got our Karen here in Australia, and again, she's parading as someone who cares about kids and banning kids from social media and all the rest of it. And like, I've read Jonathan Haidt's stuff, so I get the good side of that. I absolutely get the good side of keeping kids away from a lot of things on social media. However, the stuff that she's going after, she spent over $250,000 going after this woman, Celine. And what Celine was guilty of, I'll tell you what Celine was guilty of. She was guilty of a tweet where, I think it was a tweet or a video where she was talking about she was talking about a now I've lost it. Here we go. No, I've lost it. I'll come back to you in a sec. Just a moment. I found it. So it was Celine who calls herself Celine Against the Machine on X. So she won this fight against the eSafety Commissioner, Julie Inman Grant, over attempts to block a post criticising the existence of a queer club in a Melbourne primary school. So Celine, who herself is bisexual, so she's not anti or whatever, that sort of thing, but she questioned why kids in years 3 to 6, which is what 3 to 6 is like from, I'm trying to remember the age, is it 9 through to 12, 9 through to 8 through to 12, something like that. 8 through to 11, something along those lines. So very young children. So she was questioning why they needed an LGBT club that focused on sexuality. And I think that that's a really good question. Why do they need that? And so this e-commissioner spent all of our taxpayer dollars, over $250,000, to fight her. And in the end, she won. And just fight to have her have it not be able to have her tweet removed. That's what she was fighting for, right? Is this ridiculous? It is okay to question why people want to sexualize young people. Young people, children, should just be allowed to be children. There's time for sexuality when they get older, and then we can argue about and talk about the balance and what they should be taught and what they shouldn't. But what's happening here, especially with this trans ideology, is that they're bringing in all of this to children at a very, very young age. They're introducing them to the fact that you might actually be born in the wrong body, and so the whole idea that they might be born in the wrong body, all sorts of sexual stuff that just is not appropriate for small children. Let small children be small children. Anyway, I hope today's episode made sense. I know my brain's a bit scat, so I don't know how scattered this episode is. I just wanted to, Victorian government, massive fail. They just disgusting what Jacinta Allan is doing there, and it is this mind virus that I've been talking about, and it's this mind virus of we just have to support whoever the oppressed party is, and damn the effects and damn what happens to everybody else. Once we have to decide who the oppressed is, we just do everything to help the oppressed and nothing to help the real victims, often in these situations, all the people who are really at risk, women, children, that kind of thing. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I just like to have real conversations here about things that matter. I think we need to be honest. I think we have to rail against this re-education that has been happening for the last few years. Identify where it's happening around you and don't take part in it. Don't change your languaging. Don't let the language in place tell you what you can and can't say, because you might just think, oh, well, it's just kind. But I tell you what, like in Canada, it's going to be, it's at one point what they want to be able to do is make it law that you have to, impelled thought and impelled speech, that you must think or say whatever. And like, you might think, oh, that's great because I agree with these things, but that it'll also be used against you for things that you don't agree with. So, that's just the way of it when you bring in laws to work for your political advantage, that they won't work when someone else is in power. Anyway, I'll leave it there. We need to tell the truth. We need to be honest. We need to protect people. We need to help people learn how to live comfortably in their own bodies. And we need to identify who the real victims are and who the real oppressed are, and stop supporting the inverted commas oppressed class based on all this stupid ideology in favor of helping the people who really need our help. Anyway, I'll talk about more next time I talk to you. I hope you have a great week. Please like, subscribe, share, all that jazz, and talk to you later. Thanks. Bye-bye.